Sarah Montgomery pulled her dark woolen coat tighter as the carriage bumped along the muddy road toward Thornfield Manor. The October wind of 1841 cut through the Yorkshire countryside like a knife. She was 28 years old and a widow. Her husband had died from consumption just 6 months ago. Now she was traveling to a place she had never seen before. The carriage driver was a local man with weathered hands and nervous eyes. He kept glancing back at her through the small window. Sarah noticed his worried expression but said nothing. She was used to people looking at her strangely. A woman traveling alone was unusual. A woman who studied plants and carried scientific books was even more unusual. Sarah had been a governess before marriage. She taught children about mathematics and natural science. After her husband died, she inherited some money. She also inherited Thornfield Manor from her Aunt Eleanor, who had died the year before. Sarah had never met her aunt, but the lawyers said the house was hers now. The manor appeared through the mist like a dark ship on a gray sea. It was a large stone building with many windows. Most of the windows were dark. The house looked empty and cold. Sarah felt her heart beat a little faster, but she told herself it was just excitement. She was finally free to pursue her real passion, which was studying plants. The carriage stopped in front of heavy wooden doors. The driver quickly unloaded her trunks and boxes. Sarah tried to pay him extra for his help, but he shook his head. "No, miss," he said quietly. "Just be careful in there. The locals say things about this place." "What kind of things?" Sarah asked. The man looked uncomfortable. "Old stories, miss. About the Montgomery women. They say there is a curse." Sarah smiled politely. She did not believe in curses or old stories. She believed in facts and science and things she could see and touch. "Thank you for the warning, but I am sure everything will be fine." The driver touched his hat and left quickly. His carriage disappeared into the mist within minutes. Sarah stood alone in front of her new home. She found the key where the lawyer had said it would be, under a loose stone near the door. The key was old and heavy. It turned in the lock with a loud click that echoed in the quiet afternoon. The inside of Thornfield Manor was dark and smelled of dust and old wood. Sarah opened the heavy curtains in the main hall. Weak sunlight filtered through dirty windows. She could see that the house was well built but had not been lived in for some time. There were sheets covering most of the furniture. Sarah spent her first day exploring the manor and making lists. She was very organized and liked to plan everything carefully. The house had 15 rooms, including a large library that made her heart sing with joy. The library had hundreds of books on many subjects. She found books about medicine and astronomy and natural history. Her bedroom was on the second floor with a view of the moors. She unpacked her belongings carefully. Her most precious possessions were her botanical equipment and journals. She had magnifying glasses and small tools for examining plants. She had notebooks filled with detailed drawings of flowers and leaves she had studied. That first evening, Sarah lit candles throughout the main rooms. The warm light made the house feel less empty. She made herself a simple dinner from the supplies she had brought. Then she sat in the library reading by candlelight. As she read, she began to notice small things that seemed odd. The library was colder than the other rooms, even though she had lit a fire in the fireplace. The fire burned brightly but did not seem to warm the air around her chair. She pulled a shawl around her shoulders and continued reading. Around 9 o'clock, she heard a sound from somewhere in the house. It was soft, but clear, like someone walking slowly across wooden floors above her. Sarah looked up at the ceiling. She knew she was alone in the house. The sound stopped. Sarah told herself it was just the old house settling. Old houses made many sounds, especially at night when the temperature changed. She had read about this in scientific journals. Wood expanded and contracted with heat and cold. This caused creaking and other noises. She went to bed early that first night. Her bedroom was comfortable and warm. She had brought good blankets from her old home. As she lay in bed, she could hear the wind outside. It made a lonely sound across the empty moors. Just as she was falling asleep, she smelled something strange. It was the scent of roses, strong and sweet like roses in full bloom. But it was October, and there were no roses blooming anywhere near the manor. Sarah had walked around the entire property that afternoon. She had seen no flower gardens at all. The rose scent faded after a few minutes. Sarah decided she must have imagined it. Sometimes when people were tired or stressed, they smelled or heard things that were not really there. This was also something she had read about in medical journals. The next morning, Sarah began her real work. She wanted to catalog all the plant life around Thornfield Manor. The Yorkshire moors had many interesting species. She planned to create detailed drawings and notes about each plant she found. She set up a workspace in a small room next to the library. She arranged her equipment carefully on a large wooden table. Her magnifying glasses caught the morning light. Her journals were stacked neatly beside bottles of ink and drawing pens. Sarah worked for several hours examining specimens she had collected outside. The work made her happy. She forgot about the strange cold in the library and the scent of roses. Science was logical and comforting. Plants followed clear rules of growth and change. Everything could be explained and understood. But as the days passed, more odd things began to happen. Plants that she brought inside to study would wilt overnight. This happened only in certain parts of the house. Specimens left in her bedroom or the kitchen stayed fresh for days, but plants left in the library or the main hall would be dead by morning. Sarah tried to find scientific explanations. Maybe those rooms had different temperature or humidity levels. She began taking careful measurements with her instruments, but the readings showed no significant differences between the rooms. She also began to feel watched while she worked. It was a strong sensation, like someone standing behind her shoulder. When she turned around, no one was there. The feeling happened most often in the late afternoon when shadows grew long. Sarah wrote about these experiences in her journal, but she wrote about them as scientific observations. She recorded times and locations and weather conditions. She looked for patterns that might explain what was happening. After 1 week at Thornfield Manor, Sarah made an important discovery. Behind the library, she found a small door that was almost hidden by tall bookshelves. The door was locked, but she found that the same key that opened the front door also opened this one. Behind the door was a small room filled with old papers and books. The air inside was stale and cold. By candlelight, she could see that someone had used this room as a private study. There was a desk covered with journals and letters. Sarah brought one of the journals back to her workspace. It was written in careful handwriting that was faded but still readable. The first page made her heart beat faster. It was written by Eleanor Montgomery, her aunt, who had died the year before. The journal was dated 1840, and the first entry began, "I came to Thornfield Manor to escape the noise of city life and pursue my studies in peace. But I have discovered that some studies pursue the scholar rather than the other way around." Sarah turned the page and continued reading. Her rational mind told her she was simply reading the private thoughts of a relative she had never met. But something deeper inside her whispered that she was about to learn secrets that would change everything she believed about the world. Sarah spent the next morning reading her Aunt Eleanor's journal by the window in her bedroom. The October sunlight made the faded ink easier to see. What she read made her feel cold inside despite the warm blankets wrapped around her shoulders. Eleanor had written about the same strange things that Sarah was experiencing. The cold rooms that would not warm up, no matter how big the fire. The scent of roses when no roses were blooming anywhere. The feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. But Eleanor's experiences had been much worse than what Sarah had felt so far. Eleanor wrote about hearing voices calling her name when she was alone in the house. She wrote about seeing moving shadows in her peripheral vision. Shadows that looked like women in long dresses. Sarah turned the pages carefully. The journal entries became more disturbing as the weeks went on. Eleanor had started measuring temperatures in different rooms just like Sarah was doing. But Eleanor's measurements showed impossible things, rooms that were 30 degrees colder than the rooms next to them. Temperatures that dropped 20 degrees in just a few seconds. Eleanor had also tried to photograph the strange shadows she kept seeing. Photography was still new in 1840, but Eleanor had acquired a camera and learned how to use it. She wrote that her photographs showed figures that she could not see with her eyes. Ghostly women standing in doorways and corners. Sarah put the journal down and looked out her bedroom window at the gray moors. She was a rational person who believed in science and facts. But Eleanor had been rational too. Eleanor had been trying to study and document everything just like Sarah was doing. That afternoon, Sarah decided to search the hidden room more thoroughly. She lit several candles and went through all the papers and books that Eleanor had left behind. She found more journals dating back many years. She found letters and scientific notes. She found photographs. The photographs made Sarah's hands shake. They showed the inside of Thornfield Manor, but with strange transparent figures standing in various rooms. The figures looked like women in old-fashioned clothing. Their faces were sad, and their hands seemed to be reaching toward the camera. Sarah studied the photographs with her magnifying glass. She could see that they had not been tampered with or altered in any way. Eleanor had written careful notes on the back of each photograph describing when and where it was taken. One photograph showed the library where Sarah spent most of her time working. In the photograph, there was a woman in a white dress standing next to the fireplace. The woman's face was turned toward the camera, and her mouth was open as if she was trying to speak. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had been working in that exact spot just yesterday. She had felt the strange, cold air around the fireplace. She had felt like someone was watching her. As Sarah continued reading through Eleanor's research, she discovered something that made her heart beat faster. Eleanor had found evidence that other Montgomery women had lived at Thornfield Manor before her. Eleanor had found journals written by Sarah's grandmother, Catherine, who had lived there in 1798. She had also found papers written by Sarah's great-grandmother, Mary, who had been at the manor in 1776. All of these women had experienced the same supernatural events. All of them had tried to document and study what was happening. All of them had died at Thornfield Manor under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor's final journal entry was dated just 2 weeks before her death. She wrote, "I now understand that I am not the first Montgomery woman to face these spirits, and I will not be the last. They are trying to communicate something important, but I cannot understand what they want. I fear that my time is running short. If another Montgomery woman comes after me, I hope she will continue my research and perhaps succeed where I have failed." Sarah closed the journal and sat in the cold little room surrounded by candles. She felt scared, but she also felt excited. Eleanor had gathered incredible evidence of supernatural activity. This could be the most important scientific discovery in history if it could be proven and documented properly. That evening, Sarah decided to continue Eleanor's work. She set up her own camera equipment in the library. She placed her botanical specimens on the table in careful arrangements. She lit candles around the room and waited. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Sarah began to think that maybe the spirits only appeared for certain people or at certain times. She was about to give up when she noticed something strange happening to her plant specimens. The dried flowers and leaves that she had arranged on the table were moving by themselves. They were sliding across the wooden surface slowly and deliberately. Sarah watched in amazement as the plant materials rearranged themselves into a pattern. The dried roses formed letters. The oak leaves filled in the spaces between the letters. Within minutes, Sarah could read a clear message spelled out across her work table. "Help us." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her camera. She had never operated photographic equipment before, but she had read Eleanor's detailed notes about the process. She prepared the glass plate and positioned the camera carefully. Just as she was about to take the photograph, she felt the temperature in the room drop dramatically. Her breath became visible in the suddenly freezing air. The candles flickered but did not go out. Sarah looked up from the camera and saw her first ghost. A woman in a long dress stood by the window. The woman was transparent like glass, but Sarah could see her clearly. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and sad eyes. She looked young, maybe 25 years old. She was wearing a dress from many years ago, maybe from the early 1800s. The ghost woman was looking directly at Sarah. She raised one pale hand and pointed at the message spelled out in plant materials on the table. Then she pointed at herself. Sarah stood very still, afraid to move or make any sound. She had never seen anything like this before. Her scientific mind was trying to find a rational explanation, but her eyes were showing her something that science said was impossible. The ghost woman opened her mouth as if she was trying to speak. No sound came out, but Sarah could somehow understand what she was trying to say. The woman was in pain. She was trapped. She needed help. For several minutes, Sarah and the ghost stared at each other. Then the woman began to fade away like smoke. Within seconds, she was completely gone. The temperature in the room returned to normal. The candles stopped flickering. Sarah looked down at her work table. The plant specimens were still arranged in the word "help us," but now there were other materials mixed in with her original specimens. Old flower petals that had not been there before. Leaves from plants that did not grow anywhere near Yorkshire. Sarah carefully photographed everything exactly as it was arranged. Then she sat down and began writing detailed notes about what had just happened. She wrote down the exact time, the temperature readings, and a complete description of what she had seen. As she wrote, Sarah realized that her life had just changed forever. She was no longer just a botanist studying plants. She was now a paranormal researcher trying to solve a mystery that had been puzzling Montgomery women for generations. But she also realized something else that made her feel cold with fear. Based on Eleanor's research, every Montgomery woman who had tried to help these spirits had died within 3 months of arriving at Thornfield Manor. Sarah had been at the manor for exactly 1 week. If the pattern continued, she had 11 weeks left to solve a mystery that no one had been able to solve for over 60 years. Sarah spent the next 3 days reading every journal and letter that Eleanor had left in the hidden room. She spread all the documents across the large table in the library and organized them by date. What she discovered made her feel sick with worry. The pattern was always the same. Every Montgomery woman arrived at Thornfield Manor with a logical mind and a love of learning. Each woman started experiencing small supernatural events within the first week. The events grew stronger and more frequent over the following weeks. Then, exactly 3 months after arriving, each woman died under mysterious circumstances. Sarah's grandmother, Catherine, had documented her experiences in 1798. Catherine was interested in astronomy and had come to the manor to study the stars away from city lights. Her journal described seeing moving lights in empty rooms and hearing whispers in unknown languages. Catherine's final entry was written just before her death. She wrote that she had figured out what the spirits wanted, but it was too late to save herself. Sarah's great-grandmother Mary had lived at the manor in 1776. Mary was a student of medicine, which was very unusual for women at that time. Mary's papers showed that she had experienced physical contact with the spirits. Cold hands touching her shoulders, invisible fingers moving her medical instruments. Mary had tried to communicate with the spirits using a system of knocks and taps. Her research notes ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence. Eleanor's documentation from 1840 was the most complete. Eleanor had been trained as a natural philosopher and approached the supernatural events like a scientific experiment. She had recorded temperatures, taken photographs, and made detailed maps of where each event occurred in the manor. Eleanor had discovered that the supernatural activity was strongest in certain parts of the house. The library and the main hall showed the most ghost sightings. The temperature drops were most severe near the fireplace in the library and in the corner of the main hall by the large window. Eleanor had also noticed that the activity followed a pattern based on the time of day. The spirits appeared most often at 3:17 in the morning. Eleanor had stayed awake many nights to observe this pattern. She wrote that 3:17 was the exact time when she felt the strongest presence in the house. Sarah looked at her pocket watch. It was 3:15 in the afternoon. She decided to test Eleanor's theory that night. She would stay awake and wait in the library at 3:17 in the morning to see what happened. As Sarah continued reading, she found Eleanor's most important discovery. Eleanor had figured out that all the Montgomery women were connected to the manor through their family bloodline, but they were also connected to something much older. Eleanor had found old land records showing that Thornfield Manor was built on the site of a medieval convent. The convent had been destroyed in 1539 during the dissolution of the monasteries, when King Henry VIII closed all the religious houses in England. According to the records that Eleanor found, the nuns at this convent had refused to leave peacefully. They had barricaded themselves inside their chapel and refused to come out. The historical records were unclear about what happened next, but Eleanor had found evidence suggesting that the nuns had been walled up alive inside the chapel as punishment for their defiance. The land record showed that Thornfield Manor was built directly on top of where the chapel had stood. Eleanor believed that the spirits haunting the manor were the nuns who had died in the sealed chapel. She theorized that the Montgomery women were chosen by these spirits because they were educated and could document their story. The spirits had been trying for 300 years to tell someone what had really happened to them. Sarah felt a chill as she read Eleanor's final theory. Eleanor wrote that the spirits were not trying to harm the Montgomery women. They were trying to use the women as witnesses to prove that their deaths had been murder, not just the closing of a religious house. But Eleanor had also discovered the terrible price of this communication. Each Montgomery woman became more connected to the spirits as the supernatural events increased. Eventually, the connection became so strong that the living woman was pulled into the spirit world. Eleanor called it crossing over from life to death. Eleanor's last journal entry was terrifying to read. She wrote, "I can now see and hear the spirits clearly during the day as well as at night. They are 13 women dressed in religious habits. They gather around me when I work and point toward the floor of the main hall. I believe they are showing me where their bodies are buried. But I fear that learning their exact location will complete the connection between us. I may not survive to write about what I discover." Sarah closed Eleanor's journal and looked around the library. The late afternoon sun was fading and shadows were growing longer in the corners of the room. She could feel the familiar sensation of being watched, but now it felt different. Instead of feeling frightened, Sarah felt sad for the spirits who had been trying to tell their story for so many generations. That evening, Sarah prepared for her vigil. She set up her camera equipment in the library and arranged several candles around the room. She brought Eleanor's temperature-measuring instruments and positioned them at the spots where Eleanor had recorded the strongest supernatural activity. Sarah also prepared her botanical specimens in a different way. Instead of arranging them for scientific study, she spread them across the table in a pattern that spelled out, "I want to help." If the spirits could move plant materials to communicate, maybe they would respond to her message. At midnight, Sarah sat down in Eleanor's favorite chair near the fireplace and began her wait. The house was completely silent except for the sound of wind across the moors outside. Sarah kept her eyes on her pocket watch as the minutes ticked slowly toward 3:17. At 3 in the morning, the temperature in the library began to drop. Sarah could see her breath in the suddenly cold air. The candles started flickering even though there was no wind in the room. At 3:10, Sarah heard the first sound. It was soft crying coming from somewhere above her in the house. The crying was joined by other voices whispering in what sounded like Latin. At 3:15, the plant materials on the table began to move. Sarah watched as her carefully arranged message was scattered and reformed into new words. The dried flowers and leaves spelled out, "beneath the stones," across the wooden surface. At exactly 3:17, the spirits appeared. There were 13 women dressed in long religious robes. They stood in a circle around Sarah's chair. Their faces were pale and sad. Their eyes looked ancient and tired. The woman who had appeared to Sarah 3 nights before was among them. She seemed to be their leader. The spirit women looked down at Sarah with expressions of hope and desperation. Then they all turned and pointed toward the main hall. They wanted Sarah to follow them. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs shaking with fear and excitement. She picked up one candle and walked toward the main hall. The 13 spirits glided silently beside her. In the main hall, the spirits gathered around a specific area of the stone floor near the large window. They all pointed downward and looked at Sarah expectantly. Sarah knelt down and examined the floor carefully by candlelight. At first it looked like solid stone, but when she looked closer, she could see faint lines in the rock. The lines formed a rectangle about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. It looked like an old doorway or entrance that had been sealed with stones. Sarah looked up at the spirits. They were nodding and pointing more urgently at the rectangular outline in the floor. Sarah finally understood. The 13 nuns were buried directly beneath the main hall of Thornfield Manor. They had been trying for 300 years to show someone where their bodies lay. They wanted their story to be told and their deaths to be avenged. But as Sarah knelt on the cold stone floor surrounded by 13 ghostly nuns, she realized that she was about to face the same choice that had killed every Montgomery woman before her. She could walk away and save her own life, or she could help the spirits find peace and probably die in the process. Sarah could not sleep after her encounter with the 13 nuns. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their pale faces and pointing fingers. She saw the rectangular outline in the stone floor where their bodies lay buried. The weight of their 300-year-old secret pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. For the next week, Sarah barely left the manor. She stopped taking her daily walks across the moors. She stopped eating regular meals. All her time was spent studying Eleanor's research and conducting her own supernatural experiments. The spirits were becoming bolder now that Sarah had acknowledged them. They appeared during the daytime as well as at night. Sarah would be working at her table in the library and suddenly feel a cold presence behind her. When she turned around, one or more of the nuns would be standing there watching her work. At first, the daytime appearances lasted only a few seconds. The spirits would fade away quickly, like morning mist. But as the days passed, they stayed visible for longer periods. Sarah began to have conversations with them using her plant specimens to spell out questions and answers. The spirit who seemed to be their leader was named Sister Margaret. She had been the Mother Superior of the convent. Through their plant letter communication, Sarah learned that Sister Margaret and her 12 nuns had possessed a valuable collection of medical and scientific texts. When King Henry's soldiers came to close the convent, the nuns refused to surrender their books. The books contained advanced knowledge about healing plants, surgical techniques, and astronomical observations. This knowledge was far ahead of what most people knew in 1539. The nuns believed their medical texts could save many lives if they were preserved and shared with future generations. But the king's soldiers were not interested in preserving knowledge. They wanted to seize all the valuable items from the convent and destroy any books that challenged the new religious order. When the nuns barricaded themselves in the chapel with their precious texts, the soldiers decided to make an example of them. Sister Margaret showed Sarah exactly what had happened through a series of ghostly visions. Sarah would be sitting in the library when suddenly the room would change around her. The walls became older and simpler. Religious statues appeared in corners. Sarah could see the chapel as it had looked 500 years ago. In these visions, Sarah watched the 13 nuns gather their most important books and medical instruments. She saw them lock themselves in the chapel and pile stones against the door from the inside. She watched the soldiers arrive and begin sealing the chapel from the outside with even more stones and mortar. The visions showed Sarah the nuns' final days trapped in the sealed chapel. They had water from a small well inside the chapel, but very little food. They spent their time praying and copying their most important medical knowledge onto pieces of cloth and bark in case someone found their bodies someday. Sister Margaret died last after watching her 12 sisters slowly starve to death around her. With her final breaths, she had blessed the burial site and called upon God to send witnesses who would tell the true story of how they died. These visions left Sarah exhausted and emotionally drained. She began to understand why the previous Montgomery women had died after 3 months. The constant supernatural contact was taking a physical toll on her body. She was losing weight and having trouble sleeping. Her hands shook when she tried to write in her journal. But Sarah was also learning things that no living person had known for centuries. The nuns showed her the exact location where they had hidden their most valuable texts. The books were sealed in a stone container beneath the altar of the old chapel. The altar was now directly under Sarah's bedroom floor. Sarah realized that she was walking and sleeping above one of the most important lost libraries in English history. The medical knowledge that those nuns had died to protect could revolutionize modern medicine if it could be recovered and translated. This discovery filled Sarah with a sense of purpose that was stronger than her fear. She began making detailed plans to excavate the burial site and recover the hidden texts. She wrote letters to scientists and scholars describing her findings. She prepared careful documentation that would prove the historical importance of her discovery. But as Sarah spent more time communicating with the spirits, the line between the living world and the spirit world began to blur for her. She started seeing the nuns even when she was not trying to contact them. They would appear while she was eating dinner or reading in bed. They seemed to be becoming part of her daily life. Sarah also began experiencing time differently. Sometimes she would sit down to work in the morning and discover that hours had passed without her noticing. Other times she would feel like she was living in the past, experiencing events from the convent as if she had been there herself. The most disturbing change was that Sarah started to look like the spirits. Her skin became pale and translucent. Her eyes took on the same sad, ancient expression that she saw in the nuns' faces. When she looked in mirrors, she sometimes saw Sister Margaret looking back at her instead of her own reflection. Sarah knew she was running out of time. According to Eleanor's research, she had been at the manor for 6 weeks. That left her only about 6 weeks before the supernatural connection became strong enough to pull her permanently into the spirit world. But Sarah had also made more progress than any previous Montgomery woman. She knew exactly where the nuns were buried. She knew where their precious books were hidden. She had documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. Most importantly, she had gained the complete trust of the 13 spirits. The nuns had shown Sarah something they had never revealed to Eleanor or the other Montgomery women. They had shown her their true names and the specific details of their deaths. They had given her enough information to prove that their deaths had been murder, not just the unfortunate result of religious conflict. Sarah made a decision that would determine whether she lived or died. She would not try to excavate the burial site herself. Instead, she would focus all her remaining time on creating a complete record of everything the spirits had told her. She would write down every detail of their story and prepare evidence that could not be ignored by historians and scientists. If Sarah died like the other Montgomery women, at least she would leave behind enough documentation to ensure that the nuns' story would finally be told. The 13 women who had died to preserve knowledge would not be forgotten. But Sarah also had a more dangerous plan. She believed there might be a way to help the spirits find peace without dying herself. The nuns had been trapped for 300 years because no one had ever told their complete story to the outside world. If Sarah could find a way to share their story with historians and church authorities, maybe the spirits would finally be able to rest. Sarah spent her 7th week at Thornfield Manor, writing frantically. She filled journal after journal with detailed accounts of everything the spirits had shown her. She prepared careful maps showing the location of the burial site and the hidden library. She organized Eleanor's photographs along with her own pictures as evidence. As Sarah worked, the 13 nuns gathered around her more frequently. They seemed to understand that she was trying to help them in a way that no previous Montgomery woman had attempted. Instead of looking sad and desperate, they began to look hopeful. But Sarah could feel her own strength fading as she grew more connected to the spirit world. Her body was becoming lighter and less solid. Sometimes when she reached for her pen, her hand would pass right through it like she was already becoming a ghost herself. Sarah realized she was approaching the point of no return. Soon she would have to choose between saving herself and completing her mission to help the 13 nuns. The decision would determine not only her own fate, but also whether a 300-year-old injustice would ever be corrected. Time was running out for Sarah Montgomery, and the spirits of Thornfield Manor were waiting to see what choice she would make. December 23rd arrived cold and gray. Sarah woke up knowing that this was her final day at Thornfield Manor. According to Eleanor's research, every Montgomery woman had died on the day that marked exactly 3 months since their arrival. For Sarah, that day was tomorrow, December 24th. Sarah looked at herself in the bedroom mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Her skin was pale as milk and seemed to glow with a strange inner light. Her eyes had turned the same deep gray color as the winter sky outside. When she moved her hands, they left faint trails in the air like she was already half ghost. The 13 nuns now appeared to Sarah constantly. They no longer faded in and out of visibility. They stood around her all day and night like faithful companions. Sarah could hear their voices clearly speaking in both Latin and English. She could touch their ghostly hands and feel the cold of their spiritual presence. Sister Margaret spoke to Sarah more directly now than she had ever spoken to any living person. The Mother Superior explained that Sarah had a choice to make. She could complete the connection to the spirit world and join the 13 nuns as a permanent guardian of their story. Or she could try to return to the living world and risk leaving their tale untold for another generation. Sarah spent the morning of December 23rd writing letters to important people in London. She wrote to professors at Cambridge University who studied medieval history. She wrote to officials in the Church of England who had authority over historical religious sites. She wrote to members of Parliament who could order official investigations. In each letter, Sarah explained exactly what she had discovered at Thornfield Manor. She described the burial site beneath the main hall floor. She detailed the location of the hidden medieval library under her bedroom. She included copies of her photographs showing the ghostly nuns and Eleanor's scientific measurements of supernatural activity. Sarah also prepared a special package containing all of Eleanor's research, plus her own detailed journals. She wrote careful instructions explaining how to find the hidden room behind the library. She made maps showing the exact locations of the burial site and the concealed texts. The most important item Sarah prepared was a legal document witnessed by her own signature and sealed with wax. The document officially donated Thornfield Manor to Cambridge University for the purpose of historical and archaeological research. Sarah hoped that university scholars would have the resources and authority needed to properly excavate the site. As Sarah finished her preparations, she felt her connection to the physical world growing weaker. Her handwriting became lighter and more transparent on the paper. Sometimes her pen would pass right through the letters she was trying to form. The 13 nuns watched her work with expressions of deep concern. Sister Margaret told Sarah that there had never been a Montgomery woman who came so close to solving their 300-year mystery. Eleanor had discovered their story but died before she could share it with the outside world. Sarah had not only learned their complete history, but had also prepared detailed documentation that could convince scholars and officials to take action. But Sister Margaret also explained the terrible cost of this communication. Each day that Sarah spent connected to the spirit world made it harder for her to return to the living world. The supernatural energy that allowed her to see and hear the nuns was slowly transforming her own life force into spiritual energy. Sarah had to decide whether saving 13 medieval nuns was worth sacrificing her own young life. She was only 28 years old. She had many years ahead of her if she chose to leave Thornfield Manor and return to the normal world. That afternoon, Sarah made her choice. She walked to the main hall where the 13 nuns were gathered around the rectangular outline in the stone floor. Sarah knelt down and placed her hands on the cold stones that marked their burial place. She looked up at Sister Margaret and the other spirits surrounding her. Sarah spoke aloud for the first time directly to the nuns instead of communicating through plant arrangements. Her voice sounded strange and distant as if it was coming from far away. "I understand what you want from me," Sarah said. "You need someone to stay here and guard your story until the outside world is ready to listen. Eleanor tried to leave and take your story with her, but she died before she could share it. You are afraid that if I leave, the same thing will happen again." Sister Margaret nodded slowly. The other nuns moved closer to Sarah in a tight circle. Sarah continued speaking. "But I think there is another way. I have prepared everything needed to prove your story is true. I have written to people who have the power to help you. If I can get these letters and documents to the outside world, your story will be told whether I live or die." The nuns looked uncertain. For 300 years, they had only been able to communicate with Montgomery women inside Thornfield Manor. They had no way of knowing if Sarah's letters would reach their intended recipients or if anyone would believe what she had written. Sarah stood up and walked to the window. Outside, she could see a carriage approaching the manor through the winter mist. She had arranged for the postal service to collect her letters and packages today. This was her last chance to get her documentation to the outside world before the supernatural connection became permanent. Sarah made her final decision. She would risk everything on one last, desperate plan. Instead of choosing between joining the spirits or abandoning them, she would try to do something that no Montgomery woman had ever attempted before. She would leave Thornfield Manor while still connected to the spirit world, and personally deliver her evidence to the authorities in London. If Sarah could maintain her connection to the 13 nuns while traveling to London, she could bring the spirits with her as witnesses to prove their story was true. No scholar or church official could ignore the testimony of 13 medieval nuns appearing before their own eyes. But Sarah also knew that leaving the manor while spiritually connected to the nuns might kill her instantly. The supernatural energy that kept the spirits bound to Thornfield Manor might not be able to exist in the outside world. Sarah gathered her letters and packages and walked toward the front door of the manor. The 13 nuns followed her with expressions of hope and terror. They had been trapped at Thornfield for 3 centuries. They had never tried to leave the boundaries of the manor grounds. As Sarah reached for the door handle, she felt a tremendous pull trying to drag her back into the house. The spiritual connection that linked her to the 13 nuns was fighting against her attempt to leave their domain. Sarah gripped the door handle tightly and pulled with all her remaining physical strength. The door opened and cold December air rushed into the manor. Sarah stepped across the threshold into the outside world. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sarah felt the most intense pain she had ever experienced as her spiritual connection to the nuns stretched across the boundary between the manor and the outside world. Sarah collapsed to her knees in the snow outside Thornfield Manor. The 13 nuns appeared around her, looking more solid and real than they had ever looked before. The carriage driver approaching the house stopped his horses and stared in shock at the ghostly figures surrounding the young woman kneeling in the snow. Sarah had succeeded in bringing the spirits into the outside world, but she could feel her own life force burning away like a candle in a strong wind. She had perhaps minutes left to complete her mission before the supernatural connection consumed what remained of her mortality. Sarah struggled to her feet and walked toward the shocked carriage driver. She handed him her packages of letters and documentation, along with the deed transferring ownership of Thornfield Manor to Cambridge University. "Take these to London immediately," Sarah whispered. "Deliver them to the addresses written on each package. Tell everyone you meet about what you have seen here today." The carriage driver took the packages with trembling hands. Behind Sarah, the 13 nuns stood in a perfect line, their ancient faces filled with hope for the first time in 3 centuries. Sarah had made her choice. She had risked everything to give the medieval nuns their first real chance at justice and peace. Now she would discover whether her sacrifice would save both the spirits and herself, or whether she had doomed them all to an even worse fate. The carriage driver's name was Thomas Hartwell, and he would remember December 23, 1841, for the rest of his life. He had delivered mail to remote Yorkshire houses for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like what happened at Thornfield Manor that winter day. Thomas later told the authorities that he watched Sarah Montgomery collapse in the snow, while 13 transparent women in religious clothing stood around her in a circle. The ghostly nuns looked more real and solid than any spirits he had ever heard described in local folklore. He could see their faces clearly and even notice details like the worn fabric of their religious habits. Sarah Montgomery spoke to Thomas one final time before losing consciousness. She begged him to deliver her packages to London and to tell everyone about the spirits he had witnessed. Then she closed her eyes and her body seemed to become as transparent as the ghostly nuns surrounding her. Thomas loaded Sarah's unconscious form into his carriage along with her packages. As he drove away from Thornfield Manor, he kept looking back to see if the 13 nuns were following. The spirits stood motionless in front of the manor until the carriage disappeared into the winter mist. Thomas drove straight to the nearest town and called for a doctor to examine Sarah. Dr. William Hayes found that Sarah was still breathing, but her pulse was barely detectable. Her skin was cold as ice and had an unusual translucent quality. The doctor had never seen anything like her condition. For 3 days, Sarah remained unconscious while Dr. Hayes tried every medical treatment he knew. On the 3rd day, Sarah's eyes opened, but she did not seem to recognize where she was or who was caring for her. When the doctor asked her name, she stared at him blankly and did not respond. Sarah had survived her supernatural ordeal, but the experience had changed her permanently. She had lost her memory and most of her ability to communicate with the living world. Dr. Hayes believed that her mind had been damaged by some kind of severe trauma, but he could not determine what had caused her condition. Meanwhile, Thomas Hartwell had delivered Sarah's packages to their intended recipients in London. The letters and documentation that Sarah had prepared created a sensation among scholars, church officials, and government authorities. Her photographs of the ghostly nuns were examined by experts who confirmed that the images had not been altered or faked. Professor Edmund Blackwood from Cambridge University led the first official investigation of Thornfield Manor in January 1842. Professor Blackwood was a respected historian who specialized in medieval religious sites. He arrived at the manor with a team of archaeologists and surveyors. The investigation team found everything exactly as Sarah had described in her letters. The hidden room behind the library contained Eleanor's research and photographs. The rectangular outline in the main hall floor showed clear evidence of being a sealed burial site. Temperature measurements confirmed unusual cold spots throughout the house. Most importantly, Professor Blackwood's team experienced supernatural phenomena themselves during their 3-week investigation. They photographed ghostly figures, recorded unexplained sounds, and documented temperature drops that defied scientific explanation. Every member of the investigation team witnessed at least one supernatural event that they could not rationally explain. When Professor Blackwood's team carefully excavated the burial site beneath the main hall, they made discoveries that shocked the academic world. They found the skeletal remains of 13 women arranged in a circle around a stone altar. The women had been buried with religious items including prayer books, crucifixes, and medical instruments. Most significantly, the excavation revealed a sealed stone container beneath the altar exactly where Sarah had predicted it would be. The container held dozens of medieval texts written on parchment, cloth, and bark. The texts included medical treatises, astronomical calculations, and scientific observations that were centuries ahead of their time. The medieval library that the 13 nuns had died to protect contained knowledge that revolutionized understanding of medieval science and medicine. The texts described surgical procedures, herbal remedies, and medical theories that historians had not known existed in 1539. The discovery proved that medieval nuns had been far more educated and scientifically advanced than anyone had previously believed. But the most mysterious discovery was found in the center of the stone circle, where the 13 nuns had been buried. Professor Blackwood's team found Sarah's botanical equipment arranged in a perfect pattern around a collection of dried flowers and herbs. The plant material spelled out a message in Latin that translated to, "The truth has been told." Sarah Montgomery's body was never found in the burial site or anywhere else at Thornfield Manor. She had simply vanished after delivering her evidence to the outside world. The only trace of her presence was her carefully arranged botanical specimens in a single pressed rose that had been placed on the stone altar. Dr. Hayes continued caring for the woman who had lost her memory after the supernatural encounter. But as weeks passed, it became clear that this person was not the same Sarah Montgomery who had lived at Thornfield Manor. The woman in the doctor's care had no knowledge of botany, no scientific education, and no memory of her previous life. Some people believed that the real Sarah Montgomery had died at Thornfield Manor and been replaced by a different person who only looked like her. Others thought that Sarah's encounter with the spirits had damaged her mind so severely that she had become an entirely different person. The mystery deepened when church authorities examined the skeletal remains found in the burial site. They discovered that there were actually 14 sets of remains in the stone circle, not 13 as expected. The 14th skeleton was that of a young woman who had died much more recently than the medieval nuns. The recent skeleton was buried with items that belonged to Sarah Montgomery, including her magnifying glass, botanical journals, and the key to Thornfield Manor. But careful examination of the bones showed that this person had died decades before Sarah was even born. Professor Blackwood proposed a theory that Sarah Montgomery had somehow traveled backward in time and joined the 13 medieval nuns in their final moments. He believed that Sarah's supernatural connection had allowed her to cross not just from the living world to the spirit world, but also from the 19th century to the 16th century. The official investigation concluded that Sarah Montgomery had made the greatest paranormal discovery in recorded history. Her documentation of the 13 nuns had not only solved a 300-year-old mystery, but had also provided the first scientific proof that spirits could communicate with the living world. However, the cost of this discovery remained unclear. Sarah Montgomery had either died, disappeared, or been transformed into someone completely different. The woman recovering in Dr. Hayes's care lived for many more years, but never regained her memory or her scientific abilities. She spent the rest of her life in quiet obscurity, cared for by charitable organizations. Thornfield Manor was permanently sealed by government order after Professor Blackwood's investigation concluded. The building was considered too dangerous for public access due to ongoing supernatural activity. Even decades later, people reported seeing ghostly figures in the windows and hearing unexplained sounds from the empty rooms. The medieval texts recovered from the burial site were studied by scholars throughout Europe and led to major advances in understanding of medieval science and medicine. The 13 nuns who had died to protect their knowledge finally received the recognition they had sought for 3 centuries. But the fate of Sarah Montgomery remained the greatest unsolved mystery in the entire case. She had succeeded in telling the nuns' story and ensuring that their sacrifice was remembered. She had provided scientific evidence of supernatural communication that changed how people thought about life after death. Yet Sarah herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Her botanical research was found at the burial site, but her body was never recovered. The woman who survived the supernatural encounter had Sarah's face and voice, but none of her memories or personality. Some people believed that Sarah Montgomery had made the ultimate sacrifice and given her own identity to save the 13 medieval nuns. Others thought that she had found a way to exist simultaneously in both the living world and the spirit world. The mystery of what happened to Sarah Montgomery continues to fascinate researchers and paranormal investigators even today. Her documentation of the Thornfield Manor haunting remains the most detailed and scientifically rigorous study of supernatural phenomena ever recorded. But the question that no one has ever been able to answer is whether Sarah Montgomery found a way to solve the mystery of life after death, or whether she became part of that mystery herself. The truth about Sarah Montgomery's fate may be as unknowable as the supernatural forces she encountered at Thornfield Manor. Sometimes the greatest mysteries are solved not by finding answers, but by discovering that some questions lead to even deeper mysteries that science may never be able to explain.